Well, hello everyone, and welcome to episode 75 of Debra and Peter Are Doing a Podcast with Deborah Alcott-Tyler, the Chief Executive of the Directory of Social Change, and me, Peter Wanless, who used to be someone and dabbles in bits and pieces. How are things with you, Deborah?
They're all right, Peter. They're okay. I'm happy about the nice warm weather being back, and It's a bit cooler because there's a bit of a breeze with it, so that's quite nice. Although poor puppy is still struggling a bit, bless him.
Well, I'm in London. I've got a week of stuff in London, so I am located currently in my mother-in-law's office in Southeast London, and enjoying the heat of London, which I think is a couple of degrees hotter than anywhere else.
Yeah.
I mean, what a strange life. I lived and worked here for best part of 40 years, and it does feel quite different. I mean, my goodness, all these people having coffees with one another, meeting up for a chat about this and that, summer reception parties. You know, I was at one last night. People were going to 2 or 3. You know, does anyone ever get any work done? Does anyone ever grow their vegetables and water their garden? You know, I'm very worried about my onions and my potatoes and my spinach and, you know, all this. I haven't got time for networking.
Do you know what, Peter? I will say you just really made me laugh because, of course, listeners, nominally Peter is retired. Of course, he isn't really retired because he's one of those chaps who can't, resist cracking on with stuff. But it just makes me smile about my father, who resisted retirement to 6 months after, kept saying, I'm not retired, I'm unemployed. And now says he doesn't have time to do anything because he's so busy. And there's something, isn't there, about you just get super busy in retirement. My mother says it to me all the time, darling, could you ring so-and-so for me? I'm like, Mum, I'm working, so I haven't got time. And I'm like, you're sat on the sofa in front of the telly,
Yeah, I don't like saying that I'm retired, but certainly the pattern of my life is really different, and I do, and this is a terrible thing to say, but I feel a set of kind of obligations and responsibilities back home, largely related to the garden, which I didn't and still don't feel in relation to the house and my family relationships and these sorts of things, which I do feel guilty about. But there we are. I guess we make our choices, and in the end, perhaps we all turn into our parents.
Yeah, I'm sure we do.
So so that's what I'm doing. And
well, we must shout out to our podcast producer Jose, who is Spanish.
Oh, okay. Yeah, why? Because they're still in the World Cup.
Because they are still in the World Cup, and whatever people say about how they got there, open brackets, Peter, close brackets, they're nonetheless through, and that's what counts. So Jose is a happy chappy at the moment.
Well, that's good. I'm a happy chappy as well because England is still in the World Cup. Did you stay up through the night to watch?
No, Peter. I've just already said
extraordinary game.
I don't like football. I generally don't. I get interested in it because I'm supporting my staff, who are all like mad keen football fans, or pretty much most of them. But I do have to say that, and of course, Andy and I went to bed and said, like, well, England's going to lose. It's going to be a really rotten day tomorrow because everyone's going to be pissed off and miserable. And then we woke up and discovered that we'd won. And in such a fashion, it was quite bizarre. Anyway, so the pair of us, neither of whom like football at all very much, then immediately had to go and watch the highlights to see exactly what happened. So, and I did feel a little... Yeah. I did feel a little thrill, but I've said to my team before, I can't bear watching football because it's just so stressful. You just feel ill for the entire match because, somebody gets near the goal and you're hiding behind the sofa. Whereas cricket can be exciting, but a much calmer game. Although the T20 international yesterday against India, where England literally walloped India, won by 125 runs. So we watched that. That was fun.
Oh, right. No, I haven't caught up with that because I was doing all this networking at these summer events where the stock question that everyone asks anyone who doesn't know them is, are you watching the football? And at the moment, it is a great leveler, isn't it?
It is.
I'm used to people saying that's a nice shirt or that's a crazy shirt or whatever. But at the moment, it's are you watching the football? And I did feel a sense of kind of responsibility to be present for the England game. So I went to bed at 11:30. I set my alarm for 10 to 1 in the morning. So I had a power nap. Woke up at 10 to 1 and saw that the kickoff had been postponed to 10 to 2. So I went back and had a second power nap, and and got up at 5 to 2, and then watched the game on my own, because I mean my son would have watched it, but he was away with some friends watching it somewhere else, and we'd agreed we weren't going to message one another in case the other one was asleep. But all that went to pot as the game got very exciting. So we were messaging one another. The game was going on, and then at 78 minutes, when it was completely kind of boiling up and England were just about holding on, we had a power cut at home.
No!
Yeah, and everything went off, and I suddenly found myself sitting in the dark, and that was quite stressful. And it was off for about only 30 seconds, I suppose, but it came back on. Of course, everything had to power up, the internet, the Sky TV channels, and all this ridiculous sort of stuff. And so I missed about 3 minutes, but other than that, I was completely present, and it was dramatic, and it was good for the national mood. And our next game is on Saturday night.
It is, yeah, and we will probably watch that. Although I said to Andy, we'll lose if we watch it. You know, like I don't think we should watch it personally, because I think we bring bad luck.
Right.
Although I was saying to my team yesterday, I said, England's not going to win the World Cup. England's rubbish at sports. And then I said, actually, the men's team don't ever win anything. The women's teams in most of the sports they play do exceptionally well and win lots of stuff and get through to lots of finals. So we need to make a distinction, Peter, between the shockingly poor performance of the English men's team in pretty much any sport versus the fabulous performance of the women's teams in pretty much any sport. Just to get that out there.
Yeah, that's broadly true, though I was present when the England men won the Cricket World Cup in 2019, and there's the iconic photograph of England winning that and the final run out. And if you look very carefully, I can zoom you in and show you me in the pavilion.
Oh, you lucky thing.
That's a great moment.
So exciting.
Have we had the conversation before about where were you when England won the World Cup in 1966? Do you know where you were?
Well, I was 2 years old. So
almost 2, like me, funnily enough, exactly the same age.
And I have a feeling that we were either in Malaysia or on our way to Malaysia for my father's posting. So it was around about that time that he got posted to Malaya, as we called it then. It's Malaysia.
Right. Now. So they didn't sit you in front of the television, but the scene sounds like quite a good reason.
Yeah.
Why not?
No,
my parents weren't at all interested in football, and they took me to Swanage to watch Punch and Judy on the beach, and they were delighted that it was incredibly quiet. And they told me this some years later, and I felt extremely let down by them. I felt that they really ought to have plonked me in front of the television to enjoy this historic moment. So I've never seen England men win the World Cup, but I'm looking forward to it happening in nearly 2 weeks' time. And then I've got to get a train to London on Monday morning, 6:20. So when we win the World Cup on the 19th of July, I'm hoping that my train driver the following morning is not a big football fan and sticks to his shift and gets me up to London, because I've got a meeting at 9:30 on Monday the 20th of July.
Very funny. So what else is going on? That's not the only big stories at the moment.
Well, one thing that I was quite interested in was this Prince Harry case, which he has lost, along with a load of other celebrities, against the Daily Mail associated newspapers. And what I thought was interesting about it from a broader sort of charity perspective is, here is someone who clearly has some lived experience and feels very passionately that things the newspapers have done have devastated his life, the life of his wife and his family, and has felt motivated to kind of campaign and advocate against this big company over and over and over again, to the point where he's taken them to court and lost, and now it looks like they're going to have to pay £50 million as a consequence. And the sort of broader point that I wondered and thought might be interesting to talk about is, what does that say for those of us who campaign on the back of lived experience, where we have an issue or a worry or a concern that we feel or they feel desperately hard done by about, and want to mobilize opinion and power in support of. And it's these lived experiences that are at the root of, the blood contamination scandal or the Hillsborough disaster or whatever. And there are occasions when you don't have evidence, you don't necessarily know something is going to stand up in court, but we campaigners get behind these causes and try and build momentum. But I guess it's a question of what constitutes evidence. What value does lived experience have? What works or doesn't work in a courtroom? And what can we learn as campaigners from an occasion like this, where a number of people clearly felt very strongly about something, but they have not been able to prove it. In fact, their case has been sort of pulled apart in the courts, and they've ended up with a very, very big bill.
Well, it's interesting. And I've got two things, I think, to say about it. The first one I'm going to talk about is Prince Harry's case. It is not Prince Harry's case. It is Sir Elton John, David Furnish, Elizabeth Hurley, Sadie Frost, Baroness Doreen Lawrence, and Sir Simon Hughes. And I think that the way in which the media, the mainstream media in particular, have been referring to it as Prince Harry's case, have shown all pictures of Prince Harry, it's all been about Prince Harry, kind of goes to his point. Like, why are they singling out him rather than Sir Elton John, for example? And if you think about Prince Harry is very unpopular with a lot of the British public at the moment, and certainly the establishment. I personally quite like him, but that's irrelevant. But what's happened, but Sir Elton John isn't. Sir Elton John is largely adored by both the establishment and the British public. The stories around this case would be very different if they called it Sir Elton John's case against the Daily Mail. So I think that, so that's one thing I just really, really want to make clear. That's headlines and news being incredibly manipulated about Prince Harry because people don't like Prince Harry and he feels like an easy target. They didn't, although Baroness Doreen Lawrence has been mentioned in the media coverage, not really. They haven't called it Baroness Doreen Lawrence's case because they'd be afraid to do that, I think. So that's the first point. The second thing is about lived experience. The reality is that, lived experience, or the observing of lived experience, is at the root of every single charity. Whatever they do, whether they're environmental, whether they're about animals, whether they're about children, whether they're about older people, or they're about disease or whatever, lived experience is what causes our charities to be there in the first place. And I think that perhaps what we found is that as charities become older and more sophisticated, they kind of forget the root, and you end up with, certainly on boards, more people who are observers of lived experience than actually lived experience themselves. But we can't get away from the fact that if it wasn't for somebody's lived experience or somebody observing that child being abused or whatever, we wouldn't actually have charities because people wouldn't be motivated to do something about it. And also, and I think that goes to the root of what you're saying too, Peter, is that charities are about heart. Charities are about appealing to human beings' sense of justice and fairness and compassion and care and love for each other. And that you don't get that from cold, mission statements or stats or spreadsheets or things like that. You get it from telling the story of the canal or of the beaten puppy or of the lonely child. And so, I think that I don't think we have a choice as charities. I think we have to lead with lived experience. Because that's why we exist. And
I recognise that 100%. And it's it's something which I enjoyed and felt much more. Well, there was an added dimension to what I was contributing in my professional life as a consequence of joining civil society from government, because you could lead with the heart, you could talk and think about values, you could tell stories, you could bring emotion to your arguments in a way that, as a civil servant, it was more difficult and potentially inappropriate to do. And I just want to read a little bit from the Guardian report of the case being lost. Prince Harry has lost his High Court case against Associated Newspapers and been criticised for going beyond factual evidence into advancing arguments on the issues. These were obviously matters associated with a heightened emotional state about matters he and others cared deeply about and for whatever reason had impacted them and their families. So the court of law is seeking, or being portrayed as, a dispassionate context in which emotion is not significant in evidence gathering, I suppose. So again, I sort of wonder what that tells us as charities.
Yeah.
Is it that emotion opens doors, but evidence keeps it open, or emotion is necessary but not sufficient? But if you become a very kind of cold, I mean, the law is different from life, I suppose, isn't it? It feels like a very high bar, and this is a challenge for. Particularly in these big social media companies and so on, they're going to find all sorts of ways to take us to court for some of the arguments which we are making about what we are seeing experienced by people. It looks like they're being exploited online, but how do you prove that beyond reasonable doubt to a judge who's looking dispassionately at these? Do you what constitutes evidence? I come back to again, I suppose.
Well, I think so once again, the Guardian, Prince Harry's court case. Listeners, it is not his court case. The wonderful Sir Elton John, the brilliant Doreen Lawrence. I won't comment on any of the others, but So, but once again, Peter, the existence of the law and of courts come from this innate sense of justice and fairness and people being treated in the right context for whatever they've done. So although I absolutely get your point about we have to be away from emotion, they're still driven by the same human drivers, which is that that you need to be fair to each other, you need to be kind to each other, you need to be nice to each other. Those emotions, or if you call it emotion, those human feelings drive our systems of governance. And I suspect that when people you could argue this is what's happened with Keir Starmer and the Labour Party at the moment, where you've certainly I have, and I know others have felt a real disconnect from what they're doing and from what I'm feeling and what I need to feel. And it has felt very almost managerial rather than inspirational, which I think has been one of the criticisms of Keir Starmer. So I just think, we can say to a blue in the face, we have to be dispassionate and unemotional, but it's just not possible unless you're a sociopath, and even judges have emotions and rules. But that's why we set down guidelines for sentencing, for example, so that judges aren't swayed by their emotions, that here is the rule for this particular crime and this is what's going to happen and things like that. So I think you can't escape lived experience.
And emotional storytelling and the impact of lived experience on changing the judgment of politicians is massive. So I suppose I kind of
victim statements, don't they, before sentencing? What impact has this had on us? Victim?
Very good. Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
So there's the human story always comes in.
Okay.
And you also have the defence saying, but this person was in terrible personal circumstances, and this is what caused them to behave in that way. So there's nothing in life that's dispassionate once human beings start to try and do something with it.
So there's a space for that's encouraging. So there is a space for emotion. There's a space for storytelling, and the evidential threshold in courts is appreciably higher than other contexts. But politicians can get ahead of
because what
the law stroke evidence as well, and that could work positively or negatively, depending on your perspective.
This is exactly, in my view, what Nigel Farage is doing very cleverly. What he's doing is basically, by standing down and calling another by-election, he's trying to subvert, in my opinion, the course of justice, because of course the Standards Committee are going to look at the evidence. They're going to look at what was the rule. What does the rule say? What did he do? Did he or did he not contravene? And by the way, they haven't published their findings yet. So, I find something deeply suspicious about his reacting so quickly to something that hasn't been published yet, and just makes you think he must know something, is going to be found out or what have you. But so what he's doing is he's appealing to the electorate of Clacton, who are not up in the law, who are not familiar with the rules that apply to MPs, who are not, who don't understand what the parliamentary process is, who probably don't understand why it's so important that there are standards set for MPs and they live up to those standards, how it can affect the course of democracy. And so there is something about, if you just allow human beings without giving them proper context to react, you're less likely to get good decisions. So you need both. You need the evidence and you need the human story, I think.
None of us are yet in possession of the full facts
in
relation to that situation. That's definitely for sure. So even if there were a place for some kind of wider plebiscite kind of referendum on the situation, you ought at least to be presented with the evidence, even if you then respond to them dispassionately and analytically as a judge, or analytically and emotionally as a group of people. I mean, citizens' juries are quite popular in our sector, aren't they?
Yeah.
And bringing in more voices and perspectives to help determine what is appropriate or not appropriate or relevant in an area. And I do find that quite attractive. It horrifies me, the idea of the general public, having a referendum here, there, and everywhere. We've got a parliamentary democracy. We elect people to take decisions for us, but power does feel a very long way away from communities. And this idea of bringing groups of people together to help, if not absolutely take decisions, inform judgments. We did quite a lot of that back in lottery days, and perhaps I could see that coming back in Andy Burnham's sort of every growth in every postcode or whatever it is he's saying.
Well, I agree with you actually about citizens' juries, although always with the caveats, you have to set frameworks and rules, because even people juries in courts, the judge will direct them to say that piece of evidence was not allowed, you must not take that into account in your deliberation. So there have to be, if you're just unfettered, I think probably jurors need better training, actually, because you're literally, I've never been one, but friends who have, that you're literally flung in at the deep end and you're given some rules and stuff, but nonetheless, you've got to make some quite sophisticated judgments of complex and sometimes conflicting evidence. But we have to have frameworks, and that's to keep us all safe. We talked about it with the petty cash situation last week, didn't you? If you leave the tin open, it's, human nature, I'll just, take that £1 for the trolley, and it's easily done. So you keep the box locked and you have rules around it. And that's to protect people from themselves, really. So, yes, so that it does come back to your point about lived experience, doesn't it? Is that we still have to set rules around it. Because, I always used to say, whether I think this is true or not, I don't. And I do think it's true. I think democracies actually are there to protect the minority, not the majority. Because democracies create the space for individual interest groups or communities to put forward their case. So they can petition, they can march, they can be MPs. I think people often think democracy is just about voting once every 5 years and once every however long in a local council election. Whereas for me, that's the smallest part of democracy. Most democracy is enacted by people in their everyday lives and writing to their council and, nobbling their MP when they've catched them out in petitions and, all the things I've already referred to. And I think that part of democracy is largely about protecting the minority of people who are, in a difficult or different circumstance to the majority of people in whatever way, shape or form.
So what significance would you attach to a judgment by the good people of Clacton as to whether Nigel Farage was or wasn't appropriate to be their MP, given that they are...
I would attach no significance whatsoever, because this is a group of people who are not fully informed of the facts, who don't understand what the parliamentary rules are, who are being swayed by rhetoric. I saw some of them being interviewed and, and some of the... And there was one guy in particular, which just made my stomach turn this morning, when he said, Nigel Farage wants to sort things out for British people. And you just knew the underlying edge of what was meant by British people.
Yeah.
It's like, So they're bound to vote him in, for God's sake. Nobody's standing against him, which I have to say, I also agree that the other parties don't play this game. I completely support their decision not to stand against him. It's like, it's absolutely ridiculous, playing into his trap. No thanks. and they're all united. Starmer, Badenoch, Davy. I think Zach Polanski also said they won't stand anybody. I'm fairly sure. Who have I missed?
Count Binface.
Well, he is standing apparently. I tell you what, though, wouldn't it be brilliant if he won? Oh my God, that would be just about the most English thing or British thing ever. Count Binface becoming an MP.
Well, there was an occasion back towards the end. Was it the end of the John Major government, when the government was kind of mired in sleaze, and Martin Bell, the BBC correspondent, in his white suit, won as an independent for the people in a different sort of way against Neil Hamilton, I think it was, who kind of challenged, had said, back me or sack me, and so they sacked him.
That's quite a similar situation, isn't it?
Yeah, but the events of the last 24 hours are symptomatic, I think, once again, of both our politicians and our media constantly living in the moment and tactically thinking about what can I do to get the best headline next week or 3 or 4 weeks down the line.
And this
is what I really despair of. There are some huge challenges that we face, whether it's climate change or cost of living crisis or, polarization of incomes, energy bills, all sorts of things which require a much more thoughtful and longer term perspective. But it feels impossible to do that in a situation where so many people are constantly maneuvering and manipulating what they're doing on a given day to make them look good in the next 24 hours or to further their ambitions to be the leader of their party. And so much of what we're reading about is this. Now, I've said before, I love these books which Tim Shipman writes about contemporary history, but they've just become a kind of feeding ground. Even before you do anything, you better phone Tim Shipman and tell him what you're thinking and give him some juicy quotes about how other people are acting really badly. So it all goes into the book, and you look better than you otherwise might. And people are spending so much time securing their short-term legacy that meanwhile the country's going to hell in a handcart, and that does worry me.
Well, and interesting, that does apply to charities a bit. I mean, at the moment, because so many of us are struggling, it's very, very hard to think long term when you're literally thinking about, can I make payday next month? Which supply can I fob off? That sort of thing. And so, although it's really important that we think long term, it's actually very, very difficult to create headspace for that when you're worrying about every penny coming in. And that's quite challenging for people. But I think on the whole, the sector is generally better at it, thinking long term, because, particularly, because if you work with young people, Peter, you will know this better than I, you have to think about the long term because that's what you're doing it for. You're working with, an abused or a traumatized child in order to help them be able to move into adulthood relatively healthy and, to be able to participate in society properly. So you can't think short term. You can't just think about that moment. You've got to think about sort of the pathway that they go through. So it can be quite difficult. But then again, here's another thing that I've been thinking lately. Is there any point thinking about the long term? Because the world is moving so fast and so unpredictably. I mean, I say to, charities at the moment, I mean, NCVO have launched their new strategy and good for them. And, it looks interesting. And, I hope they deliver, but they almost inevitably won't, because something will come up, something will change, some circumstance, some economic circumstance, some political circumstance will come and throw it off course, and that's what happens. So I now say to boards and chief executives, it's not about your long-term strategy and your vision. Absolutely, be clear about where you want to get to, but don't rely on plans because they will change. The best thing you can do is prepare yourselves to be resilient, prepare yourselves to swiftly change. So you need to create the systems and cultures within your organization so that you can have rapid communication, rapid decision-making where it's necessary, that you've got the right sources of intel coming into you so you can have some sense of how you can predict, my God, the economy is going to tank in the autumn. Let's do something about it now. I think that is much, much more a useful skill in the modern world than being able to write a 5 or 10-year strategy.
Yeah. But hold on to what you stand for and what makes you distinctive. And actually, for individual charities and for the sector, I think in this context, it is really distinctive to associate with these big challenges and stand firm and understand why, particularly for some of the more iconic, brands. You have been here for some time, and demonstrate that. I think people will look for strong institutions in a storm where everything else is swirling around, and there are individuals and organizations in our sector that can bring real comfort and strength in what otherwise feels like a hurly-burly.
Yeah, that's very true. Very true. And what always strikes me, Peter, when we have our discussions on our podcast, even though we go all over the place, because listeners, we don't really prepare. We just turn up, have a couple of topics, and chant.
Speak for yourself.
But how often what happens on a broader political or social scale is so relevant to our charities. And of course, that makes sense because, again, charities exist because there have been failures at political or social levels. And that's why charities have to step in and solve the problem. So we're definitely, part of the whole picture of the success or failure of any of our country, I think.
Yeah. Agreed. Well, on that note, I'm off into London to brave the heat of the city.
Oh, it's going to be horrible, Peter.
Catch up with a few people, go to the odd drinks reception or two, have a coffee.
And try not to
worry about my dried out onions.
I was going to say, try not to weep over the fact your cabbages are back at home, gagging for water. All right,
brilliant.
Peter.
All right,
lovely.
take care.
Okay, listener. Next time. Bye.
Bye.